The folded bills slid back under the door before Eva Hawthorne even had time to straighten up from her knees. She stared at them. The lamplight from the hallway caught the edge of the paper, and for one wild, humiliating moment she thought she had imagined it. She had counted those bills 3 times before tucking them into the envelope. $40. Every cent she owed Arthur Bishop for the month of September, for the room above his livery stable that had become the only safe place she had known in 2 years of running. She had slid them under his door at 10:30 at night because she could not bear to look at his face when she paid him. She could not bear to see the pity, or worse, the judgment, or worst of all, the warmth that had started appearing there in the last several weeks, and he had slid them right back. There was a note tucked between the bills, a small square of paper folded once. Her name was written on the outside in a hand that was careful and deliberate, the letters formed by a man who had not grown up around books and had taught himself to write late in life. She knew that because he had told her so one evening on the back porch of the stable, when the conversation had gone longer than either of them intended, and the stars had come out without either of them noticing. Her fingers were shaking when she unfolded it. The note said, "The room is yours for as long as you need it. I will not take your money, Eva. I already took enough from you, even if you do not know it yet. When you are ready to hear the truth, I will be here. Do not run, please." Eva pressed the note against her chest. The hallway of the Bishop livery's upper floor smelled like hay and saddle leather, and the faint ghost of a dinner she had not been invited to share, but had been left outside her door anyway, covered with a cloth, warm enough that he must have carried it up the moment she heard her come in from town. She had eaten it without thinking about what it meant, which was exactly what Arthur Bishop did. He made things easy without making a scene about it, and the ease of it had been lulling her into a safety she could not afford. She did not sleep that night. To understand why a note folded by a quiet, broad-shouldered livery operator could undo a woman who had survived what Eva Hawthorne had survived, you had to go back 8 months, to the February morning she arrived in Harlan Creek, Colorado, with nothing but a carpetbag, a lie, and a plan that had already started to fall apart before the stagecoach stopped rolling. The year was 1882. And the town of Harlan Creek sat at the base of the San Juan Mountains like something a drunk man had dropped and forgotten to pick up. It had a general store, a post office that doubled as a telegraph office on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a barbershop, 2 saloons, a church that was also a school on weekdays, and a livery stable that was, by general agreement, the most reliable business in the county. The man who ran it was Arthur Bishop, 34 years old, with a reputation for being impossible to read and absolutely impossible to cheat. Eva had not planned on cheating him exactly. She had planned on staying long enough to collect what was owed to her, and then disappearing. That was the entire plan. It had seemed clean enough in Pueblo, where she had put it together in the back room of a boarding house, while the man she had been running from slept 3 rooms away, unaware that she had already found out what he had done. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he had been her husband for 13 months before Eva discovered that the land deed he had shown her before their marriage, the deed to 200 acres outside Harlan Creek with a good creek running through it and timber on the north slope, was legally hers. Her father had left it to her in a will that Gerald had intercepted and altered. By the time Eva understood what had happened, Gerald had already sold the southern 40 acres to a mining concern, mortgaged the rest, and was in the process of transferring the title into a company name that would make it nearly impossible for her to recover anything. Her father, Thomas Hawthorne, had died in the spring of 1880, and she had believed the story Gerald told her about the will, that the land had been left in trust to a cousin, because her father had not thought a woman could manage it alone. She had believed it because she had married Gerald 4 months after her father's death, when she was grieving and exhausted, and Gerald Marsh had seemed like a safe harbor in the chaos of loss. It had taken her a year and a half to realize the harbor had a hidden reef. The woman who discovered the truth was not the woman who had wept at her father's graveside. That woman had been soft and trusting and slow to suspect the worst of people. The woman who boarded the stagecoach to Harlan Creek in February of 1882 was something harder. She had a letter from a Pueblo lawyer named Crane, who had agreed to help her for 30% of whatever she recovered. She had a copy of her father's real will, which Crane had tracked down through a courthouse in Denver after 3 months of searching. She had a loaded derringer in the lining of her carpetbag, and the cold, focused intention of a woman who had decided that she would not be afraid anymore. What she had not counted on was Arthur Bishop. The stagecoach driver dropped her at the edge of town in a snowstorm, because the regular stopping point at the main street was blocked by a collapsed fence that had fallen across the road. Eva walked the last quarter-mile in wind that cut through her wool coat like it was muslin, dragging her carpetbag through snow that came up to her ankles, and by the time she pushed open the door of the livery stable, because it was the nearest building with light coming from it, she was shaking so hard her teeth were clicking together. Arthur Bishop was at the far end of the stable, doing something to the rear fetlock of a bay horse. He straightened when she came in, and he took in the situation in one calm, sweeping look that she would later come to understand was the way he looked at everything. Assessing, patient, not unkind. He said, "There is a stove in the back office. Wood's already in it, help yourself." He did not ask her name. He did not ask what she was doing alone in a snowstorm. He went back to the horse. Eva was so grateful that she almost cried, which would have horrified her. She found the office and the stove and held her hands over it until the shaking stopped. When she came out 20 minutes later, he was done with the horse and was filling a water bucket. He looked up and said, "You need a room." "Yes," she said. "I don't know how long." $1.50 a week, he said. "Stairs are behind that door. Second room on the right is empty. There's a lock on it," she said. "I would like to know the name of the person I'm renting from." He looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile but was in the same territory. "Arthur Bishop," she said. "Eva Hawthorne." She gave her real name without thinking about it, which she would later recognize as her first mistake, or possibly, depending on how she measured things, her first step in the right direction. The room was small and the window faced the alley, and the mattress was better than she expected. She lay on it fully dressed with the derringer under her pillow and tried to build a wall around the feeling of relief that was threatening to turn into something more dangerous. She was not here to feel safe. She was here to take back what was hers. The next morning, she learned that Gerald Marsh was not in Harlan Creek. She had assumed he would be there, managing his stolen interests in person, but the man at the general store, a talkative fellow named Beaumont who needed no encouragement to share information, told her that Gerald Marsh came through every 6 weeks or so to check on things but mostly operated out of Denver now. He had what Beaumont described as a fine house on the east side and a business partner of some kind who had money. This complicated things significantly. Eva sent a letter to Crane in Pueblo with the new information and settled in to wait for instructions. While she waited, she did 2 things she had not planned on doing. She took a job helping the schoolteacher, a young widow named Frances Alcott, with the Tuesday and Thursday classes because she needed money and because doing something useful kept the fear from settling in too deep. And she started talking to Arthur Bishop. It was not intentional. He was simply there. The stairs to her room ran through the stable, so every time she went in or out she passed through his world. And over the first 3 weeks of February, that world gradually revealed itself to be a great deal more interesting than a livery stable in a small Colorado town had any right to be. Arthur Bishop had been born in 1848 in Kentucky. He had come west at 17, which meant he had been here since 1865, the year the war ended, and Eva found herself wondering more than once in those early weeks what it meant that a Kentucky boy had headed west the moment the fighting stopped rather than going home. She did not ask, because she was not here to collect his history. But she noticed things. He had books on a shelf in his office, real ones, histories and a few novels, and a surveyor's manual that looked well used. He read in the evenings by the light of the lamp, and sometimes she could see the light under his office door when she came in late from Francis Alcott's house, where she had taken to staying for supper and conversation. He was not a talkative man, but he was not cold. When he spoke, it meant something. When he asked how she was settling in the second week of February, she gave him the usual answer, and he said, "You don't have to do that," without any preamble or softening, and she had stopped and stared at him. "Do what?" she asked. "Answer as though I asked for a performance," he said, not unkindly. "I was asking actually." "I am managing," she said, which was the closest she had come to honesty with anyone in 6 months, and she could feel the danger of it the way you feel the cold when you step close to a window in January. "That's better," he said, and went back to what he was doing. She thought about that exchange for 3 days. March came in cold and dry, and Eva got a letter from Crane. The news was mixed. The legal case for recovering the land was solid, Crane said, but it would take time. Gerald had been clever about the paperwork. More importantly, Crane had discovered something that changed the nature of the situation significantly. Gerald Marsh was not just a forger and a thief. He had done this before. There was a woman in New Mexico, a widow named Dorothea Picard, who had lost a ranch to Gerald through similar means in 1878. Dorothea was willing to testify if they could get the case to a federal court, but she was also scared, and she had reason to be. One of Gerald's business associates, a man named Cole Reardon, had a reputation for discouraging witnesses. Eva read the letter sitting on the back porch of the livery where she sometimes sat in the evenings, and for the first time since she had started this fight, she felt something shift inside her. Not fear. Something that resembled it but was darker and more personal. Because Cole Reardon was not a name she knew from Gerald's business dealings. Cole Reardon was a name she knew from her father's life. He had been Thomas Hawthorne's foreman for 3 years before her father had fired him for stealing. Eva had been 17 then and had not understood all the details, but she remembered her father's face when he came home from that confrontation, and she remembered thinking that something serious had happened. If Cole Reardon was working with Gerald Marsh, this was not just about a stolen land deed. This was something that had started before her father died, possibly before her marriage, possibly before she had any idea it was happening. She sat very still on the porch until the cold drove her inside, and when she came through the stable, Arthur was at the workbench near the door, mending a harness by lamplight. He glanced at her once, and whatever he saw in her face made him set down the harness. "Sit," he said. She sat on the hay bale near the workbench. She did not mean to tell him anything. She had not told anyone anything. Francis Alcott knew she had come from Pueblo and was handling some legal business, nothing more. But Arthur Bishop was looking at her with that steady, unhurried attention, and the weight of carrying the whole of it alone had been building since February. She told him a partial version. Not Gerald's name, not her father's name, not the land deed. She said she had a legal matter involving property she had inherited, and she had reason to believe the people on the other side of it were not above using means beyond the courtroom. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How long have you been carrying this by yourself?" She said, "A while." He said, "Is there anyone who knows where you are? Anyone on your side of it?" She said, "A lawyer in Pueblo." He said, "That's not enough." She said, "I know." He said, "I'm not going to pry. But I want you to know that if it becomes necessary, I have no particular fondness for people who use force on people who can't match them." He paused. "I've got a rifle and I know this county well. That's not a small thing." Eva looked at him for a long moment. He was not making an offer dramatically. He was stating a practical fact in the same tone he would use to say the water trough needed filling. The simplicity of it cut through every defense she had and landed somewhere soft and unprotected, and she had to look away quickly. "Thank you," she said. It came out smaller than she intended. "You're welcome," he said, and picked up the harness again. She went upstairs and lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling and had a very firm conversation with herself about what was and was not happening. She was a woman in a complicated legal situation who was renting a room from a decent man. That was the entire extent of it. She would resolve her business, recover her land, and leave. She had no room in her life for anything else, and she certainly had no room for the particular warmth that had started spreading through her chest whenever Arthur Bishop looked at her as though she were actually worth looking at. April was when things started to move, and when the complications began multiplying. Crane sent another letter saying he had filed the initial documents and Gerald had been notified. This meant Gerald would be coming to Harlan Creek, and when he did, he would find out that his estranged wife was living above the livery. Eva had known this day was coming, but knowing it and being ready for it were different things. She also, in April, found out something about Arthur Bishop that she had not known, and which she would have preferred to learn some other way than overhearing a conversation in the barber shop that stopped the moment she came in. The conversation had been about her, specifically about her living at the Bishop livery. And the reason it had stopped when she entered was that one of the men had been in the process of explaining something about Arthur Bishop's past that the other men clearly felt was relevant to Eva Hawthorne's presence in his establishment. She got the rest of it from Frances Alcott that evening, because Frances was a woman who believed in honest information and had enough respect for Eva to deliver it plainly. Arthur Bishop had come to Harlan Creek in 1874. Before that, he had been in the New Mexico Territory. Before that, he had been a great many places. What was relevant, Frances said, was what had happened in 1872 in a town called Raton, New Mexico, that no longer existed by that name or in that form. Arthur had been working as a deputy sheriff there, young and inexperienced, and in a situation that had gotten beyond him faster than he knew how to handle. There had been a family. A woman and her 2 children who were sheltering in a building that caught fire during a confrontation between a local land baron's men and a group of ranchers. Arthur had tried to get them out. He had gotten the children out. He had not gotten the woman out. Her name had been Clara. She had been the wife of one of the ranchers. She had been 26 years old. Frances told Eva this carefully, watching Eva's face as she did, and Eva tried very hard to receive it as information rather than as an emotion. She was not entirely successful. "He blames himself," Frances said. "He left Raton and came north and has never gone back. The people here know the rough outline. Nobody discusses it with him because he doesn't invite that kind of discussion." Eva said, "Does he know you told me?" Frances said, "No. Do you want me to tell him?" Eva said no, and meant it, but for reasons that had gotten complicated without her permission. She understood now why a man who could read a room and mend a harness and give away a warm room in a snowstorm had chosen to build his life around a stable in a small town, where the needs of horses were clear and the demands of people were manageable. He had built himself a small, controlled world where he could be useful without getting close enough to fail anyone again. She recognized it the way you recognize a strategy you yourself have used. She had done the same thing, just in a different direction. The recognition was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her yet. She was still sitting with that recognition, still trying to figure out what it meant and whether it changed anything, when Gerald Marsh rode into Harlan Creek on the second Thursday of April with Cole Reardon riding alongside him, and 2 men she did not recognize at the back. She saw them from the window of the schoolhouse. She did not panic. She had promised herself she would not panic, and she had kept that promise through things that deserved panic, so she kept it now. She finished the lesson she had been helping Frances with, and when the children filed out at noon, she told Frances there was a situation and to please act normally until she sent word. Then she walked back to the livery. Arthur was outside talking to a man about a wagon wheel. He glanced at Eva as she approached, read her face in that single practice sweep, and said to the wagon man, "I'll look at it this afternoon," in a tone that closed the conversation. The wagon man tipped his hat and moved on. Arthur said quietly, "Who came in?" Eva said, "My husband." She had not told him she had a husband. She had told him about the property and the legal danger, but not the specific shape of the connection. She watched him absorb this, watched his face settle into the careful blankness he used when he was deciding something. "Former husband," she said. "In practice, the legal part is still being resolved." "Does he know you're here?" "He will by nightfall," she said. "Towns this size, someone will tell him." Arthur said, "Then you have a few hours. What does your lawyer say you should do?" She said, "Stay put. Don't confront him. Let the legal process work." Arthur said, "Is the legal process going to work?" She said, "Crane thinks so. But it takes time, and Gerald has a man with him named Cole Reardon who I have reason to believe does not respect legal processes." Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come inside." He made coffee, which she had learned was his way of signaling that a conversation was going to require full attention. He made it in the small iron pot on the office stove and poured it into 2 plain tin cups, and they sat across from each other at the workbench, and she told him the rest of it. Gerald's name, her father's land, the altered will, Reardon's history as her father's fired foreman, all of it. Arthur listened without interrupting, and when she finished he said, "Cole Reardon, I've heard that name." He said it carefully as though he was testing the weight of something. "How?" she asked. He said, "There was a man named Reardon mentioned in connection with a situation in Las Animas County 2 winters ago. A rancher who had his water rights disputed in a way that turned ugly. I heard about it from a man who passed through here, someone I trusted." He stood and went to the shelf with the books, reached behind it and took out a flat tin box. From the box, he took a small folded newspaper clipping, creased into quarters from much handling. He unfolded it and set it on the bench. It was from the Las Animas County Advertiser, dated November 1880. The relevant paragraph described a legal dispute over water rights in which a Pueblo businessman had been named as the adverse party. The businessman's name was Gerald B. Marsh. Eva felt the room tilt slightly. She steadied herself by putting both hands flat on the workbench. Arthur said, "I kept it because the method sounded familiar to something I had seen in New Mexico. I did not know then that it would be relevant to anyone I knew." She said, "How long have you had this?" He said, "Since the man who gave it to me passed through, which was about 18 months ago." 18 months ago she had been in Pueblo, newly married and beginning to suspect she had made a terrible error. She had not yet found the will. She had not yet found Crane. She had not yet run. She looked at Arthur and said, "This is not a coincidence, is it, that you kept this?" He said, "I keep things I think might matter someday. It's a habit. I was not keeping it for any specific purpose." She believed him. That was the thing about Arthur Bishop. He was constitutionally incapable of being anything other than exactly what he was. She had been around enough liars to know that the absence of performance was one of the rarest things in the world. She said, "I need to send this to Crane." He said, "I'll ride to the telegraph office with you." "Not because you need an escort," he added, and something about the care with which he said that, the acknowledgement of her independence even in the middle of protecting it, made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "But because I know the operator and he'll give it priority." Gerald did not confront her that day. He did not confront her the next day either. He was clearly aware she was in Harlan Creek, because on the 3rd day she passed him on the main street and his face told her everything she needed to know about how he felt about the situation. He was not frightened. He was not guilty. He was calculating. Cole Reardon, by contrast, looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has already started solving. She told Arthur about both looks that evening. He said, "Reardon is the one to watch." She said, "I know." He said, "I have 2 things to say and then I will leave it alone. First, you do not have to keep all of this inside the boundary of your room. If something is wrong or something happens, you can come and tell me regardless of what time it is. Second," he paused for a moment, and Eva had the impression this second thing had been sitting in him for a while waiting to come out. "You have handled all of this with more steadiness than most people could manage. That is not nothing. I want you to know someone sees it. The silence after he said that was the most dangerous silence she had ever sat in. She said, "Arthur," he said, "I know. I'm not asking anything of you," she said. "I don't know what I'm doing with what you just said." He said, "Neither do I." He almost smiled. "That makes two of us trying to figure it out." She went upstairs, and the wall she had been so carefully maintaining had a crack in it large enough to put her fist through, and she stood at the window looking out at the dark alley, and she thought about what it would mean to let it fall. The crisis arrived at the end of April in a form she had not anticipated. Crane sent a letter, but not about Gerald, about her. Or rather, about the legal question of whether Eva Hawthorne Marsh had the standing to recover the land independently, given that she was still technically Gerald's wife, and the property laws of Colorado in 1882 were not built to favor married women recovering assets from their husbands without a divorce being finalized first. Crane said he was working on it, but the honest answer was that the case would be stronger, significantly stronger, if the divorce were final before the land transfer question was adjudicated. The problem was that Gerald had not agreed to the divorce Eva had filed for in February through a Denver attorney. He had every incentive to delay it, and he had the resources to delay it for a long time if he chose to. Eva wrote to Crane saying she understood and asking what the best path forward was given the constraints. She sent the letter and then sat in her room, and for the first time since leaving Pueblo, allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she was facing. She had been running on the fuel of purpose and anger for months, and the anger had kept her warm and moving, but it could not last forever. There was a version of this story in which Gerald won, not because he deserved to win, but because the machinery of the law was built by men like Gerald and ran the way men like Gerald needed it to run. She was still sitting with that when there was a knock at her door. It was Arthur. He had a plate of food because Frances Alcott had sent supper over and he was bringing her share up. That was the detail that got her in the end, not the food. The fact that he had climbed the stairs and knocked rather than leaving it outside her door, the way he usually did, because something in the quality of her silence earlier in the evening had apparently told him that tonight was different. She opened the door and he looked at her face and said, "Do you want company or do you want to be alone?" She said, "Company." She said it before she could take it back. He came in and put the plate on the small table and she told him about Crane's letter and the divorce delay and the legal tangle, and he listened, and then he said something she had not expected. He said, "I know someone in Denver, a judge. He is not the kind of man you could bribe." He said this with a slight emphasis that told her he understood that distinction mattered to her, but he is the kind of man who hates when the law is used as a weapon against the people it was built to protect. He presided over a case in '79 in which a woman recovered property that had been transferred without her consent. He wrote the opinion himself. Eva said, "How do you know him?" He said, "He is my mother's brother." She stared. He had given her almost nothing about his family in all the weeks of conversations. The Kentucky past, the going west, the long years alone. Not a word about family. He said, "I have not spoken to him in 6 years. We did not part on easy terms." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because after Raton he wanted me to come back east and I would not. He thought I was burying myself out here out of guilt. He was probably right." He said this with the complete, unsentimental honesty that was one of the things she had come to find most precious about him. "But he is still my uncle and he knows the law, and if I write to him, he will answer. He might be able to advise Crane. He might be able to do more than that." Eva said, "Arthur, why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet the lamplight fell across his face in a way that made her suddenly, sharply aware of how much she did not want to be in a room from which he had gone. He said, "Because it is the right thing to do." She said, "That's not all of it." He said, "No, it is not all of it." The silence held everything they were not saying yet. She did not push it. She was not ready, and she suspected he knew that, and the patience in him, the steady, unhurried willingness to wait, was one of the things she was most afraid of because she could not find anything wrong with it and she had been looking. He wrote to his uncle the next morning. She wrote to Crane. The waiting resumed, but it had a different texture now. She was no longer waiting alone. May passed in a complex dance. Gerald Marsh stayed in Harlan Creek, which worried Eva more than if he had left, because it suggested he was planning something specific rather than managing things from a distance. Reardon had taken a room at the better of the two saloons and spent his days in a way that looked idle but felt purposeful, the way a card player looks relaxed at the table. Eva continued helping Frances at the school and taking her meals in the evenings increasingly at the table in Arthur's office, which had become, without formal announcement, a shared space for two people who ate together, because neither of them had found a convincing reason not to. They talked about everything during those meals, about the books on his shelf and the history she had studied at the Girls' Academy in Cincinnati before her father moved west and took her with him, about the children in the school and their individual peculiarities, about the San Juan Mountains that Arthur knew from years of riding through them on various errands he described with a vagueness that she no longer questioned. They talked about Clara, not all at once, over several evenings, in pieces, in the way that very heavy things can sometimes be moved if you carry them gradually. He told her about Raton and the land dispute that had created the conditions for the fire, and she told him that she knew the outline of it already, and he said, "Francis," with a tiredness that was not quite blame. She told him it had not changed anything she thought about him. He said, "It should," she said. "It told me something about you that most people never figure out about themselves. You know what you failed to do. Most people can't name it that clearly. Most people find ways to make it someone else's fault." She paused. "My father was like you. He could name his mistakes and he carried them honestly and he kept going anyway." Arthur said, "What was he like?" And she talked about her father, Thomas Hawthorne, who had come west from Ohio in 1865, with a land claim and a plan and an 8-year-old daughter, and had built something good in the Colorado Territory that he had intended to leave to her, and had been cheated out of leaving it by a man he trusted and by a foreman he had been too generous with. She talked until the lamp burned low, and when she stopped, Arthur said, "He would be proud of what you're doing." She said he would be worried about the danger of it. He said, "That too, both those things can be true." She looked at him across the table and she thought, "I am in serious trouble." She thought, "I knew this was going to happen and I let it happen anyway." She thought, "I am not sorry." The letter from Arthur's uncle arrived the 3rd week of May. His name was Robert Bishop, and he was a federal circuit judge based in Denver, and the letter he sent was 3 pages of careful legal analysis followed by a final paragraph that was personal. He said he was glad Arthur had written. He said he hoped the woman whose situation Arthur had described was being looked after. He said he would be passing through Harlan Creek on the 17th of June on his way to a court session in Durango, and he would stop and speak with both her and her lawyer if she wished. Eva read the letter at the kitchen table in Arthur's office, and when she reached the final paragraph she said, "He knows." Arthur said, "He suspects," she said. "He says he hopes the woman is being looked after. He said it like that on purpose." Arthur said, "My uncle has always been extremely indirect when he is being direct." She said, "What did you tell him about me?" Arthur was quiet for a moment. "I told him the legal facts of your situation. I told him you were the most determined person I had known in a long time. I told him you deserved to win this." She folded the letter with great care and set it down on the table and said, "Arthur." He said, "Eva." She said, "I am going to say something and I need you to not respond to it immediately." He said, "All right," she said. "I am afraid. Not of Gerald and not of Reardon, although I am appropriately afraid of both of them. I am afraid of what is happening between you and me. I am afraid because I cannot afford to be distracted and I cannot afford to be vulnerable right now, and you are both of those things to me. You make me feel safe in a way I have not felt in years, and I know that safety can become its own kind of trap." He was quiet for so long that she began to regret saying it. Then he said, "I am afraid too. I have been afraid of it since March." She said, "What do we do about it?" He said, "I don't know. I have been trying to figure that out." He looked at her steadily. "I can tell you what I have decided, which is that I am not going to push you toward anything you're not ready for, and I am not going to pretend I don't feel what I feel, because I am no good at pretending and you would see through it anyway." She said, "I would." He said, "So we know where we are." She said, "Where are we?" He said, very simply, "I care about you more than I know what to do with, and I intend to be here when this is over regardless of what that means." She stood up from the table and crossed the small office in 3 steps and took his face in her hands, which were shaking slightly, and she kissed him once, briefly and completely, and then she stepped back and looked at him, and he was looking back at her with an expression so unguarded that she felt the last of the wall come down. She said, "Now I have said the other thing." He said, "Yes." She said, "The timing is terrible." He said, "The timing of things that matter usually is." June arrived, and with it, the convergence of forces that Eva had known was coming, and had been trying to prepare for without knowing exactly what form it would take. Crane arrived from Pueblo on the 5th, a neat, ferret-quick man who wore a city suit that looked wrong in Harlan Creek's dust, and shook Eva's hand with both of his, and said the case was ready to move. The documentary evidence was solid. The testimony from Dorothea Picard, the woman from New Mexico who had also lost land to Gerald, had been secured. There were 2 other potential plaintiffs Crane had found who were considering joining. The weak point was still the divorce, because Gerald continued to block it, but Judge Robert Bishop's analysis had pointed to a federal property law argument that might let them go around the divorce issue entirely. Crane said, "The risk is that we have to move fast. If Marsh figures out the federal angle, he'll file something to block it." Eva said, "He already knows something is moving. He's been here for 6 weeks." Crane said, "Has he approached you?" Eva said, "Not directly." Crane said, "His lawyer filed a motion in Denver last week claiming you abandoned the marital home without cause, which is his attempt to muddy the property question. The judge assigned to that motion is not Robert Bishop." Eva said, "What can we do about that?" Crane said, "Robert Bishop can potentially get jurisdiction transferred if the federal property angle holds, but we need him here in person to look at the documents." He was coming on the 17th. They had 12 days. On the 9th of June, Cole Reardon came to the livery. Eva was upstairs when she heard it, the voices below, one of them Arthur's and one of them a voice she did not know but which had a quality that made her skin tighten. She went to the top of the stairs and listened. Reardon was asking about the room above the stable, whether it was rented, whether the tenant was planning to stay long. He asked it in the studied, casual way of a man who knows exactly what he's asking and wants you to know that he knows. Arthur said in a tone that had no warmth or hostility, just the flat evenness of a man stating a fact, "The rooms are rented on a private basis and I don't discuss tenants." Reardon said, "Just curious about the neighborhood." Arthur said, "Anything else I can help you with?" Reardon said, "Nice place you've got here, Bishop. Be a shame if it had trouble." There was a brief silence, and then Arthur said, "A shame, yes. Goodbye." She heard Reardon's boots cross the stable floor and exit. She heard the door close. She came down the stairs. Arthur looked at her and said, "Don't let that change anything you're planning." She said, "He was threatening you." He said, "He was attempting to." "There's a difference," she said. "Arthur, I will not have you in danger because of me." He looked at her with the closest thing to impatience she had ever seen from him and said, "Eva, I'm a grown man who has been in a number of difficult situations and made my own choices about them. This is my choice. Do not take it from me." She looked at him for a long moment and then said, "All right." He said, "Good. Now let's talk about what we're going to do about the next 12 days. What they did was methodical and careful. Crane had his documents. Arthur sent word to the county sheriff, a capable man named Harlan who had known Arthur for years, about Reardon's implied threat, framing it in terms that were not alarming but created a record. Frances Alcott, who had proven to be more resourceful than her mild appearance suggested, offered the use of her house for the meeting with Robert Bishop, so that the livery was not the site of a gathering that might attract attention. Eva wrote 3 letters in those 12 days. One to Crane, confirming arrangements. One to Dorothea Picard in New Mexico, telling her the timeline and thanking her for her courage. And one, which took her the longest, to herself, which was not really a letter but a decision written down to make it real. She wrote it at night with Arthur's lamp and Arthur asleep in his cot downstairs, and in it she said what she had been circling since March, that she was in love with Arthur Bishop and it was not going to stop, and the only question was what she was going to do with that truth. She folded the letter and kept it. Robert Bishop arrived on the 17th, riding alone, a man in his late 50s with the same careful eyes as Arthur but a warmer presentation, a man who had built his life around language rather than silence. He embraced Arthur in the street in front of the stable, and Arthur received it with a stiffness that softened by degrees, and Eva watched from the doorway and felt something loosen in her chest at the sight of it. Robert shook her hand and said, "I understand you have been managing a very complex situation with considerable ingenuity." Eva said, "I have been trying." He said, "My nephew tells me you have been doing substantially more than trying." Arthur, standing beside him, said nothing, but the back of his neck went slightly red, which Eva filed away with great care. The meeting at Francis Alcott's house lasted 4 hours. Robert Bishop read all of Crane's documents with the focused attention of a man who reads legal arguments the way other men read maps. He asked questions that were precise and occasionally uncomfortable, and Eva answered all of them without evasion, because evasion had been Gerald's tool, and she had decided early on that she would not use any of Gerald's tools. At the end of the 4 hours, Robert said that the federal property argument was sound, and he believed he could justify jurisdiction on 3 separate grounds. He said the motion about abandoned domicile was a nuisance filing, and he could dismiss it with cause. He said the strongest element of the case was the evidence of prior pattern, meaning the Las Animas County situation and Dorothea Picard's testimony, and that a federal court would find that evidence highly relevant. He said, "How quickly can your lawyer have the federal filing prepared?" Crane said, "A week, maybe less." Robert said, "Make it less. I have a session in Durango ending on the 1st of July. I can hold a preliminary hearing in Denver on the 5th if we can get there." Crane said, "We can get there." Eva felt, for the first time since February of 1880 when her father had died, and she had not yet understood what was being taken from her, something that she recognized after a moment as hope that was not laced with fear. On the evening of the 17th, after Robert had settled at the hotel and Crane had retired to his room to begin drafting, Arthur and Eva sat on the back porch of the livery in the warm June evening, and she told him what hope felt like when you had been afraid for so long that it had become your normal temperature. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want to say something that I have been working up to for about 2 months." She said, "Say it." He said, "When this is over, when the case is resolved and you have your land back and you are free to make whatever choices you want without this weight on you, I would like to ask you something." She said, "I know what you want to ask." He said, "Then you know that I mean it." She said, "I know you mean it. You don't know how to not mean things." She looked at him. "The answer when you ask it will be yes." He turned to look at her, and his expression was unguarded in the way she had come to love most, the way that happened when he let her pass the careful management of himself. He said, "You're sure?" She said, "I have never been more sure of anything." "That terrifies me slightly, which I think is probably correct." He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat in the warm evening with the mountains dark against the indigo sky and the stable sound soft behind them, and it was, Eva thought, the most peaceful moment she had been inside since she could remember. The next morning, Gerald Marsh made his move. He came to the livery just after dawn alone, which surprised her. She had expected Reardon, and she had expected confrontation, but what she got instead was Gerald at his most dangerous, which was Gerald being reasonable. He was a handsome man in his early 40s, well-dressed, with a plausible face that had always been his best tool. He had used it on her at their worst moments, and she had almost believed it each time. He said he wanted to talk. He said there was no reason for the situation to be as complicated as it had become. He said he was prepared to make a settlement offer that was fair to both of them. Eva met him in the stable because she did not want him in her room and did not want to have the conversation in the street. Arthur was at the far end of the stable, moving horses, and she was aware of his presence the way you are aware of solid ground when you are standing on it. She said, "I will hear your offer." Gerald said the offer was 60 acres of the original parcel, a cash payment, and an uncontested divorce. He said it with the slight condescension of a man who expected her to be grateful. Eva said, "The parcel is 200 acres. 60 acres is not equitable." Gerald said, "Be reasonable, Eva. You don't have the resources to fight a Denver attorney in federal court." Eva said, "I do, actually." Gerald's face shifted slightly. He said, "Your little lawyer from Pueblo is not equipped for what I can bring to bear." She said, "I'm aware that you have advantages I don't, Gerald. I've been aware of that since before I left. I came here anyway. That should tell you something about whether I intend to be reasonable in the terms you mean." He looked at her with the calculation that she recognized from those last months in Pueblo, when the mask had started slipping, and she felt nothing now that resembled the fear she had felt then. What she felt was the clean, simple resolution of a woman who had gotten to the other side of something terrible and found herself still standing. He said, "You should think carefully about this." She said, "I have." "The answer is no. My lawyer will be in touch with yours. I would like you to leave the stable." He left. Not immediately and not without a look at Arthur's back that had a message in it, but he left. Arthur turned around when the door closed. He said nothing. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the look between them was a complete conversation. She said, "It's moving now." He said, "Yes." He crossed the stable and stopped in front of her. "How are you?" she said. "I am unexpectedly well." He said, "Good." He put his hand on the side of her face briefly and then stepped back, because Arthur Bishop was constitutionally incapable of a grand gesture, and she had stopped wanting one. The 2 weeks before the Denver hearing were the most complicated she had managed. Reardon made one more attempt at intimidation, this time directed at Crane, appearing outside Crane's temporary office in Harlan Creek and staring at it for an afternoon. The county sheriff, having been previously alerted by Arthur, appeared and had a quiet word with Reardon, and Reardon departed. Gerald filed 2 more motions in the Colorado State Court, both of which Crane flagged for Robert Bishop, and both of which Robert assessed as delaying tactics that would not survive federal scrutiny. Francis Alcott, who had become in these weeks something indispensable to Eva beyond the professional, said over supper one evening, "I want to ask you something personal." Eva said, "Ask." Francis said, "Arthur Bishop has been in this town for 8 years, and I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. I want to know if you're going to stay." Eva said, "I want my land back. The land is near here." Francis said, "That's not an answer." Eva said, "It's the closest I can give you right now. Ask me again in August." Francis said, "I'm marking my calendar." On the 1st of July, Eva, Crane, Robert Bishop, and because Eva asked him and he said yes without hesitation, Arthur boarded the stage north and then east toward Denver. Robert's session in Durango had concluded. The hearing was set for the 5th. Dorothea Picard had traveled up from New Mexico and would arrive in Denver on the 3rd. The journey was 2 days, and Eva spent most of it in a state of focused attention that she would later recognize as the concentrated form of everything she had built in herself over the preceding 2 years. All the fear turned into fuel, all the grief turned into intention. Arthur was across from her in the stage, and they talked through long stretches of it, and in one of the silences he looked at her and said quietly, under the noise of the wheels, "Whatever happens, I want you to know that." She said, "I know." He said, "I wanted to say it before in case it helps." She said, "It helps more than I can tell you." The hearing on the 5th of July was not dramatic in the way that legal proceedings become in the telling afterward. It was 4 hours of documents and arguments, and a witness statement from Dorothea Picard that was delivered with the composed clarity of a woman who had also decided that being afraid was not going to be her permanent condition. The attorney Gerald had brought from Denver was skilled, but Robert Bishop's legal reasoning on the jurisdiction question had been meticulous, and Crane, who had clearly worked for the better part of 2 weeks without sleeping much, was sharp and specific in a way that mattered. The preliminary ruling came the next morning. Property recovery proceeding approved under federal jurisdiction. The state motions dismissed. The divorce question separated from the land question and referred to a sympathetic family court judge with a note from Robert that carried weight. The title to the 200 acres, less the 40 Gerald had sold to the mining concern, which was a complication that would take additional months, but was clearly recoverable, provisionally returned to Eva Hawthorne pending final adjudication. Eva stood outside the courthouse in Denver on the morning of July 6, 1882, in the sun, and Arthur was next to her, and Crane was shaking everyone's hand in sequence, and Robert Bishop was talking to another judge he had spotted on the steps, and Dorothea Picard, who was 50 and silver-haired and had the handshake of a woman who had roped cattle, took Eva's hands in both of hers and said, "Your father would have been furious with all of them and very proud of you." Eva said, "You knew my father," Dorothea said, "only by reputation. Thomas Hawthorne was known in the territory as a fair man. That means something in this part of the world." Eva felt it then. The thing she had been holding off for 2 years, the full weight of her father's death and what had been done in its aftermath, and she let herself feel it for one long moment in the Denver sun, and Arthur was there, not touching her, just there, and that was exactly right. She turned to him. She said, "Let's go home." He looked at her, and on his face was the expression she was going to spend the rest of her life learning the details of. He said, "Yes." It was on the stage back to Harlan Creek that Eva thought about the note. She had kept it, folded, in the lining of her carpet bag, where the derringer had been before she left it in her room. The derringer she would probably not need anymore, or not in the same way. The note she would keep forever. "The room is yours for as long as you need it. I will not take your money, Eva. I already took enough from you, even if you do not know it yet. When you are ready to hear the truth, I will be here. Do not run, please." She had asked him about it on the night she received it, eventually. She had waited until they were past the worst of it, past the hearing and the ruling and the long journey back, until they were home again, until home was a word she used without thinking about what it meant. She had asked him about the line that said, "I already took enough from you." He had told her then, in full. He had known more than she realized about Gerald Marsh before she arrived in Harlan Creek. The newspaper clipping had been one piece. The other piece was that the man who had given it to him, the traveler who passed through in 1880, had mentioned the name Hawthorne in connection with the Las Animas County situation. He had not understood at the time that the Hawthorne mentioned was Eva's father. But when she had given him her name that first night in the February snowstorm, the connection had surfaced immediately. He said, "I kept information that might have helped you sooner. I was not sure of its relevance, and I was uncertain about my own position." "That was a failure," she said. "You gave it to me the moment you connected the pieces." He said, "I should have pushed harder sooner." She said, "Arthur, you gave me everything you had. You connected me to your uncle. You sat with me through all of it. You wrote to a man you hadn't spoken to in 6 years because you thought it might help me." She looked at him steadily. "Whatever you failed to do sooner, you found the way to it eventually. I know the difference between that and not trying." He looked at her for a long time and then said, "How do you know how to say exactly the right thing?" She said, "I had a good father who taught me to pay attention to people." He asked her to marry him on a Sunday evening in August, on the back porch of the livery, with the San Juan Mountains going gold in the evening light. And he did it in the plain-spoken, unembellished way that was entirely his. And she said yes in the same register, and they sat together in the evening for a long time afterward, not needing to say anything more. They were married in September 1882 by the minister who ran the church and the school, with Frances Alcott as Eva's witness and Robert Bishop, who had made the journey from Denver for the occasion, as Arthur's. Dorothea Picard sent a letter from New Mexico that made Eva laugh and then tear up in close succession. The general store man, Beaumont, was there because he had apparently been there for every significant event in Harlan Creek for 20 years and saw no reason to stop now. Eva wore a dress that Frances had helped her alter, a blue wool that had been her best dress since Ohio and which fit her differently now, she thought, because she herself was different. Arthur wore his good coat and had made a visible effort with his hair, which made Robert Bishop smile with the smile of a man who had not expected to be smiling at this particular occasion when he rode south from Denver. After the ceremony, Robert took Arthur aside for a few minutes, and Eva did not hear what they said, but when Arthur came back to her, his expression was the same one he had after the stage ride from Denver, the one she was still cataloging. He took her hand and said, "He wants us to come to Denver for Christmas." She said, "Do you want to?" He said, "I think I do. Yes." She squeezed his hand and said, "Good. I want to meet the rest of your family." He said, "That might take more than Christmas." She said, "Then we'll start there and keep going." The final adjudication of the land came through in November, the same month the Colorado autumn turned the aspens to gold, and the mountains got their first serious snow. Eva stood at the window of what was now their room, the room she had first entered in February with a carpetbag and a lie, and she held the letter from Crane that confirmed the title was entirely in her name. The 40 acres sold to the mining concern was a separate matter still being processed, but Crane was confident. Arthur came up behind her and read the letter over her shoulder and said nothing, just put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him and felt the full strange miracle of being exactly where she was. She said, "I want to go see it." He said, "Your land." She said, "Our land, if you'll come." He said, "I'll come." They rode out the next morning, the two of them, and a packed lunch that Arthur had organized with characteristic efficiency, and when they crested the low rise that gave the first full view of the parcel, Eva stopped her horse and looked at it for a long time. The creek her father had mentioned ran bright and cold through the eastern edge. The timber on the north slope was exactly as he had described it. There was a remnant foundation where a structure had stood and been abandoned, probably left from a previous claim. She said, "My father planned to build here." Arthur said, "What did he want to build?" She said, "A house with a kitchen garden and a barn that faced east, because he believed animals were calmer when the barn faced east. He said he read it in a farming journal, and it might have been nonsense, but it stuck with him." Arthur looked at the land, the creek, the north slope. He said, "There's good ground for a kitchen garden on the south side of the creek. The eastern exposure for a barn would work if we set it here." He pointed. She turned to look at him. He said, "If you want to build on it," she said, "you'd leave the stable." He said, "I'd find someone to run it. This is your inheritance. It should be a home, not a legal document." She looked at the land and looked at him and said, "It already is both." They broke ground in the spring of 1883. With a local builder named Patterson and two men Arthur hired who turned out to be excellent with timber and completely impossible to manage, but in an amusing way. Frances Alcott came out to see the foundation going in and said it was going to be a fine house, and Eva believed her. The house was finished in the fall of 1883, in time for winter, which Eva privately thought was her father's doing in some form she couldn't name but chose to believe in anyway. It had a kitchen garden that Frances helped her plant with seeds ordered from a catalog in St. Louis, and a barn that faced east, and a porch on the south side where the sun came in long and warm in the afternoon. Robert Bishop came for Christmas as promised, and then came again in the spring, and the stiffness between him and Arthur had thawed to something that was not quite repaired but was healing, which Eva thought was the best form of repair available to two proud men who both knew they had been wrong. Dorothea Picard's additional testimony in the final stages of the land case, and the ongoing New Mexico proceeding had, in November of 1883, resulted in Gerald Marsh being formally indicted in federal court on charges of fraud and falsification of documents. Eva received a letter from Crane about it on a cold November morning and read it at the kitchen table while Arthur made coffee, and she said, "Gerald has been indicted," and Arthur set down the coffee pot and turned to look at her. She said, "It's done." He said, "How do you feel?" She sat with that question for a moment, looking out the kitchen window at the east-facing barn and the frost on the kitchen garden and the mountains beyond. She said, "I feel like I can stop looking over my shoulder." He came and sat across from her, and they drank their coffee in the morning quiet and the freedom of it. The actual physical sensation of a weight that had been carried for so long that it had been mistaken for the weight of the self, lifted, was something she would try to describe to Frances later that week, and not quite manage. Gerald was tried in February of 1884 and convicted. Cole Reardon, as part of his own separate arrangement with a federal prosecutor, had provided information about Gerald's operations that had accelerated the timeline considerably. Eva did not go to the trial. She did not need to see it to know it had happened. What she needed she had. Their son was born in June of 1884, on a Tuesday morning when the summer came in gentle and warm. They named him Thomas for her father. He had Arthur's careful dark eyes and her own stubborn chin, and Arthur held him with the focused concentration of a man who was doing the most important thing he had ever done and knew it. Frances Alcott was there when Thomas arrived, because she had become by that point so entirely part of the family that the idea of her not being there for something like this would not have made sense to anyone. She held the baby while Eva slept and Arthur sat beside the bed, and later she told Eva that the expression on Arthur's face while he watched her sleep was the thing she was going to remember most about that day. Eva said, "What did it look like?" Frances said, "Like a man who has finally gotten home and knows it." Eva thought about that for a long time. She had started when Thomas was small enough to sleep in the crook of her arm in the afternoon, writing things down. Not for any particular purpose, not for publication or for posterity. Just the record of it, because she felt the importance of not losing the specific shape of what had happened. The way the stable had smelled on that first February night, the weight of the note in her hands, the lamp in Arthur's office casting its long shadow, the sound of the stagecoach leaving Harlan Creek the morning they went to Denver, the mountains behind them getting smaller in the window. She wrote in the spring of 1885, sitting on the south porch with Thomas asleep in a basket near her feet, and the mountains clear and enormous and permanent in the afternoon light, something that she had been trying to find the words for since that September evening in the stable, when she had received $40 back under a door with a piece of paper that said, "Do not run." She wrote, "The bravest thing I ever did was not the lawsuit. It was staying in that room when every instinct I had trained toward survival was telling me to go. The bravest thing was opening the door when he knocked." She folded the paper and put it with the others. Arthur came around the corner of the house from the direction of the barn, stopping when he saw her on the porch, and he had that look, the one she had been cataloging for 3 years now, the one she was still finding new details in. He came up the porch steps and looked at Thomas asleep in the basket and then looked at her. He said, "Patterson wants to talk about the fence line." She said, "I know. I'll ride out with you this afternoon." He sat down next to her. He said, "What are you writing?" She said, "The part where I stayed." He looked at her and then at the mountains for a moment. Then he said, "I am glad you stayed." She said, "I know you are." He said, "I mean I am glad every day, in a way I cannot usually find the words for." She put her hand on his arm. She said, "You found them." The summer of 1885 was warm and long, and the creek ran high and clear all the way through August, and the kitchen garden was so productive that Eva gave half of it away to 3 neighboring families and still had enough to put up for winter. Frances Alcott married a widowed cattleman named Graves in September, a quiet ceremony that she organized with the same practical efficiency with which she organized everything. And Eva stood at her side exactly as Frances had stood at hers 2 years before. Robert Bishop came again at Christmas, and he and Arthur sat together by the fire after the meal and talked for 3 hours in the low, unhurried way that Eva recognized as the sound of two people who have worked through something difficult and come out the other side of it into the simpler country of just being family. She watched from the kitchen doorway with Thomas on her hip and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing being made right that had needed making right for a long time. In February of 1886, 4 years to the month from the morning Eva Hawthorne had walked into a stable in a snowstorm with a lie and a plan, and found herself face to face with a man who had given her a warm stove and asked nothing. The final paperwork on the full 200 acres came through Crane's office. The 40 acres sold to the mining concern had been recovered through a negotiation that had taken 2 years, and left Crane exhausted and triumphant in equal measure. He sent the documents with a letter that said, "I believe my 30% has been more than earned," and Eva thought it had and wrote him a check without hesitation. She spread the deed on the kitchen table that evening. Arthur came in from outside, stamping snow from his boots, and saw her looking at it. He came to stand beside her. He looked at the document, the legal language of it, the boundaries described, the creek marked in its right place, the timber noted, the name in the line that said owner, Eva Bishop. She had taken his name. She had done it simply and without ceremony the day they married because it had seemed right and had gone on seeming right ever since. She said, "It's all there," he said. "Yes," she said, "everything my father meant to leave me." He put his arm around her and she leaned into the warmth of him, and she thought about the note as she sometimes did when a moment required the full accounting of how they had arrived inside it. Do not run, please. She had not run. She had stayed. She had opened the door and found the truth on the other side of it. Not the comfortable truth or the uncomplicated truth, but the real one. The kind that has weight and asks something of you and gives back more than you expected to find. Thomas, now almost 2 years old, was in the next room making sounds that meant he was awake from his afternoon sleep and ready to make his existence known. And in a moment one or both of them would go to him. But for now they stood at the kitchen table in the winter afternoon, looking at the piece of paper that had 200 acres and a creek and a north timber slope and a name on it. And the quiet between them was the kind that only exists in the lives of people who have found their way to each other through something real. Outside, the mountains stood in the February cold, the same as they had always been, permanent and indifferent and beautiful. And the smoke rose from the chimney of the east-facing barn, and the kitchen garden was under its snow waiting for spring, and the stove was warm, and they were home. In the spring of 1887, their daughter was born. They named her Clara, and Arthur held her in the afternoon light of the bedroom window, and his face had the same look it had held when he held Thomas for the first time, but layered now with something that Eva, watching him, understood was a form of completion. He had been carrying the name Clara as a weight for 15 years. Now he was carrying it differently. He looked up from the baby and found Eva watching him and said, "Is this all right, the name?" she said. "It was my suggestion," he said. "I know. I wanted to make sure you still meant it," she said. "I still mean it. She is named for a woman who mattered and for what you have carried honestly all this time. That seems right to me." He looked back at the baby, and the look on his face was the one she loved most, the unguarded one, the one that had nothing between it and the world. He said, "It is right." Clara grew up with Thomas pulling her around the property in a small wooden wagon that Arthur built in the stable, which he still ran 2 days a week, with a local boy named Pete doing the daily work. She grew up knowing the names of the mountains from the south porch, and the names of the creek birds from her mother, and the names of every horse that had ever been in the Bishop's stable from her father. She grew up in a house that had a kitchen garden and an east-facing barn, and a shelf of books that kept growing, and parents who talked to each other in the evenings after supper in a way that she would only understand much later was not how everyone's parents talked, was in fact something rare and earned. Eva looked back at the long road of it sometimes, in the evenings on the south porch, in the way you look back at a journey from a high vantage point where you can see the entire route at once. The boarding house in Pueblo, the stagecoach in the snow, the stable door, the note. The note had been the turning point, which was strange when she thought about it, because a note was such a small thing. $40 slid back under a door. A man who could have used the money and did not, who could have kept his distance and did not, who could have said nothing and instead had written please. She had asked him once why he had written please. He had said, because I was not sure if you would listen to anything less. She had said, you were right. He had said, I know. It was the truest thing I had ever written, and I barely knew you. She had thought about that for a long time, the truth before the knowledge, the recognition before the certainty. The reaching toward something you cannot fully name but cannot afford not to reach for, in a life where everything else has been uncertainty and motion, and the long practice of not getting too comfortable. Frances Graves, who had her own child now, a small fierce girl named Margaret, came to visit in the summer of 1888, and she and Eva sat on the south porch in the afternoon while the children played in the creek, and Frances said, "Do you remember when I asked you if you were going to stay?" Eva said, "You marked your calendar." Frances said, "I did. You told me to ask again in August, and I asked again in August, and you said yes." Eva said, "I did." Frances said, "Was it the land or was it him?" Eva looked out at the creek where Thomas was helping Clara navigate the stepping stones with the focused older brother patience that he had been developing for the past year, and which delighted her every time she saw it. She said, "The land was my father's reason for coming here. My reason for staying was sitting at a kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night making me tell the truth about how I was doing." She paused. "They turned out to be the same place. That seems like something my father would have arranged if he could." Frances said, "I think he would have liked Arthur." Eva said, "He would have been suspicious of him for about 3 months and then respected him completely for the rest of his life." Frances laughed and Eva laughed and the children splashed in the creek, and the mountains were clear and blue and enormous in the summer afternoon, and the life that had been stolen from her and recovered and rebuilt was entirely, completely, exactly here. Arthur came around from the barn in the late afternoon, the same walk he had always had, deliberate and unhurried, and he stopped at the porch steps and looked up at her with the look, and she looked back at him, and 15 years from now she would still be learning the details of it. He said, "Patterson wants to know about the north fence line again." She said, "That man and his fence lines." He said, "You have better things to do today." She looked at him. She said, "No, let's go." She stood and he offered his hand and she took it, and they walked together toward the north slope in the evening light, and the mountains were going gold behind them, and the creek ran clear and cold through the land that was hers and his and theirs together, and the smoke from the kitchen chimney rose straight up in the still air, and every step they had taken to get here, the hard and frightening ones and the ones that had required more courage than she had known she had been exactly and entirely worth it. She was not running anymore, she was home,